Snow filled my mouth. I spat out a mouthful of pine needles and blood, dragging myself behind a frozen dumpster. This was not how a king was supposed to spend a Tuesday. 3 hours ago, I was reviewing commercial real estate contracts. Now, I was freezing to death in a back alley snowdrift because a gang of oversized, overconfident idiots decided a zoning dispute over a strip mall required an ambush. I could have slaughtered them. I should have. But starting a political scandal right before the solstice was exactly what my council wanted. So I chose the indignity of a tactical retreat. I fought my way out using nothing but teeth, claws, and sheer, undignified brute force. To drop my scent, I shifted back to my human skin, which left me here, naked, covered in embarrassing sloppy bruises, shivering so violently my teeth felt loose. My vision swam. The biting wind felt like sandpaper against my bare, bruised back. I tried to stand, forcing my shattered pride to hold my weight, but my injured leg buckled entirely. I hit the pavement hard. As the edges of my vision went black, I managed to lift my head toward a buzzing, half-broken neon sign, blinking through the blizzard. Mountain View Veterinary Clinic. Walk-ins welcome. Welcome back to Tiana's Collections. I absolutely love seeing this community grow across the globe. So head down to the comment section right now and let us know where you are listening from today. If you want to stay one step ahead of the story, hit that join button below to become an official channel member. You'll unlock early access to all our latest uploads before anyone else. Plus, you'll get exclusive loyalty badges to make your name stand out in the comments. Thank you for being such an amazing part of our pack. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's dive into today's romance. Chapter 1. Locking the clinic's front door was always a gamble. Tonight, the deadbolt had frozen completely solid. I jammed my keys into my coat pocket, mentally calculating if I could afford a locksmith before the electric company shut off my power. The math wasn't in my favor. It never was. I was 28. Buried under 6 figures of medical debt, and running a failing rural practice. The wind howled, burying my boots in fresh snow. I pulled my scarf up and turned toward my rust bucket of a van. That was when my foot caught on something completely immovable. I went down hard, scraping my knees painfully against the icy pavement. "Are you kidding me?" I muttered, spitting slush from my mouth. I looked back, expecting a fallen tree branch. Instead, I found a mountain of bruised, completely naked muscle. I blinked, wiping sleet from my eyelashes. The sheer, absurd scale of the man was undeniable. He was curled on his side, shivering violently, covered in a sloppy network of angry scratches. Okay, which local college fraternity is responsible for this? I sighed, pushing myself up. If this is a hazing ritual, you guys are paying for my dry cleaning. No response. Just a ragged, rattling breath pluming in the freezing air. My clinical instincts bypassed my exhaustion. I couldn't leave a half-dead, hypothermic linebacker freezing in my parking lot. I grabbed him under his heavy arms and hauled. It was like trying to drag a damp, concrete refrigerator. I groaned, my muscles burning, boots slipping wildly on the ice as I dragged his dead weight inch by agonizing inch back through the clinic doors. By that time, I managed to hoist him onto the stainless steel examination table, in treatment room 2. I was sweating through my thermal parka. "You are so lucky I handle draft horses," I wheezed. I grabbed a stack of fuzzy pink blankets from the surgical incubator and piled them over his impossibly broad chest. I actively tried to ignore the sheer mass of him. He was built like a mythological statue someone had repeatedly thrown down a flight of stairs. I grabbed my medical tray. His cuts needed covering. But naturally, my adult bandages were entirely depleted. "SpongeBob it is," I murmured, peeling the bright yellow, cartoon-printed pediatric strips and slapping them over the worst of his scrapes. He flinched at the cold antiseptic spray, a low, unnerving vibration echoing deep in his chest. I leaned directly over him, clicking my penlight on to check his pupils. The proximity hit me without warning. The sharp, overpowering scent of pine, crushed snow, and something deeply, violently primal. For a split second, my carefully guarded pulse actually skipped. Then his hand shot out. Thick, calloused fingers clamped around my wrist with the unyielding force of a steel trap. The man's eyes snapped open. They were wild, furious, and completely disoriented. He didn't look like a frightened patient. He looked like a cornered apex predator, realizing he was trapped on a humiliating, sterile metal slab. He shoved himself upward, the pink heated blankets pooling embarrassingly around his waist. He glared down at me, inflating his massive chest to its full, intimidating capacity, and let out a terrifying, chest-rumbling, absolute nightmare of a growl. It was a sound that literally rattled the glassed medical cabinets. A raw, instinctual demand for total submission. I didn't even flinch. I reached over to the counter with my free hand, grabbed the latest issue of Modern Feline Digestion, rolled it into a tight cylinder, and smacked him directly on the nose. "No," I said flatly. "We do not growl at the person holding the thermometer." Chapter 2. The silence in the examination room was absolute, save for the rhythmic, aggressive humming of the faulty fluorescent light overhead. The massive man on my table blinked. His terrifying predator gold eyes crossed slightly as he looked down at the rolled-up copy of Modern Feline Digestion, still resting against the bridge of his perfectly straight nose. He didn't move. He barely seemed to breathe. He just stared at the magazine, then slowly shifted his gaze to my face, looking utterly, profoundly flabbergasted. Did you just strike me?" he rumbled. His voice was a physical weight in the small room, a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated right through the soles of my cheap winter boots. "It was a tap," I corrected smoothly, stepping back and tossing the magazine onto the counter. "A correctional tap. My draft horses get it when they try to bite, and you get it for attempting to shatter my eardrums. Now, lay back down before your blood pressure spikes and you stroke out on my sterile field." He did not lay down. Instead, he pushed himself up into a fully seated position, the movement so sudden and fluid it defied the sheer amount of tissue damage I had just assessed. The fuzzy, pink-heated blankets pooled embarrassingly around his waist, doing absolutely nothing to diminish the sheer, absurd intimidation factor of his chest. He was glaring at me with the kind of absolute, unwavering authority that made people apologize for breathing his air. "I demand you fetch my counsel," he commanded, crossing his tree-trunk arms over his chest. He glanced at the bright yellow SpongeBob square plastered over his sep, his eye twitching violently. "And remove this neon mockery from my flesh, immediately. Bring me a prime rib, rare. Tell no one I am here." I stared at him. The sheer audacity of this naked, bleeding man sitting in my failing clinic and ordering me around like a feudal lord was staggering. I let out a sharp, breathless laugh, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Right. Okay. Severe concussion it is," I muttered, turning to my medical cabinet. I yanked open a drawer, grabbed a foil-wrapped rectangle, and tossed it directly at his chest. He caught it out of the air with terrifying reflexes, staring at the label with deep revulsion. "What is this?" "It's a chalky, terrible, expired protein bar," I replied, crossing my arms and mirroring his aggressive posture. "You are eating it because you are hypothermic, delusional, and currently bleeding onto a table that I still owe $400 on. You are not getting a prime rib because my budget for this week consists of instant ramen and whatever loose change I can find in my van. So, eat the bar or I am putting the cone of shame on you." His jaw actually dropped. The imposing, terrifying aura he was trying so desperately to project fractured into pure, unadulterated confusion. He looked at the bar, looked at me, and then let out a low, dangerous breath that sounded suspiciously like a hiss. "You do not know who I am," he stated, narrowing his eyes. He leaned forward, the pink blanket slipping dangerously low. The proximity was suddenly suffocating. I could smell the sharp, metallic tang of his blood, mixed with the freezing scent of the pine forest outside. He was so close I could see the minute, furious clenching of his jaw muscles. "If you knew what you were speaking to, human, you would be kneeling on this linoleum." I didn't back up a single inch. I had survived a disastrous 3-year relationship with a narcissistic investment banker who thought raising his voice equaled winning an argument. A grumpy lumberjack with a head injury wasn't going to make me crack. The only thing I am kneeling for is to scrub the slush you dragged onto my floors. I fired back, my voice dripping with cynical exhaustion. I don't care if you're the mayor of this mountain. You're a walk-in. And in my clinic, walk-ins eat their protein bars. He stared at me, his chest heaving. I could see the exact moment his brain short-circuited. He was entirely unused to being denied. He opened his mouth to unleash what was undoubtedly going to be a devastating, ego-crushing monologue. Clack, rattle, smash. We both froze. The heavy, ominous sound echoed from the front reception area. It wasn't the wind. It was the violent, deliberate rattling of the clinic's reinforced glass front doors. Someone was out there trying to force the deadbolt. Through the frosted glass of the treatment room, I saw 3 large, dark silhouettes pacing like caged animals against the snowstorm outside. Chapter 3. The temperature in the examination room seemed to plummet 10 degrees in a single second. The man on the table didn't flinch, but his entire demeanor shifted. The arrogant, confused patient vanished. In his place sat a coiled spring of pure, lethal violence. His shoulders locked, his head tilting slightly, as if tuning into a frequency I couldn't hear. "Did you lock the doors?" he asked. His voice was no longer a booming command. It was a lethal, quiet rasp. "Yes," I whispered, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. The cynical bravado I'd been wearing cracked. We were miles from the main road. The blizzard was blinding, and my nearest neighbor was a heavily armed dairy farmer 2 miles away. The deadbolt is frozen solid. "Who is that? Did you bring a gang out here?" "They are not my people," he growled, swinging his legs off the side of the table. He didn't even wince as his bare feet hit the freezing linoleum. "They are a petty, territorial problem, and they are hunting me. Great, fantastic. I love being accessory to a mountain turf war," I hissed, lunging for the bulky landline phone mounted on the wall. "I'm the county sheriff. No." Before my fingers could even graze the receiver, he moved. It was a blur of sheer, impossible speed. 1 second he was on the table, and the next, his massive, bruised body was pressing me flat against the wall. His hand shot past my head, closing around the plastic phone receiver. With a sickening crack, he ripped the entire unit, cords, mounting bracket, and drywall, straight out of the wall. "Are you out of your mind?" I shrieked, shoving hard against his chest. It was like pushing a brick wall. That was my only line out. "Cell service is dead out here." "The police cannot help you with this," he snarled, dropping the ruined phone onto the floor. His chest was heaving, brushing against my coat. The physical tension between us was electric, suffocating, and entirely unwanted. "If those scouts breach that door, your local sheriff will be nothing but a temporary distraction before they tear this building apart to get to me." "You are delusional," I yelled, refusing to cower, even though I had to crane my neck painfully just to look him in the eye. "Who do you think is out there? The mafia? Over what? A bad poker game?" "A zoning dispute, actually," he snapped back, the utter absurdity of the statement entirely lost on him. "And they are not the mafia. They are wolves, as am I." I stared up at him. The adrenaline pumping through my veins screeched to a halt, replaced by a wave of profound, exhausting annoyance. "Oh my God. You have a traumatic brain injury. You are hallucinating." "I am not hallucinating, human," he ground out, stepping even closer. "I am an alpha. I was ambushed in my fur, and I will not let them find me compromised in your pathetic, sterile box." "Stop calling my clinic a box," I yelled back, "and stop talking like a rejected fantasy novelist." "Wolves? Really? You think you're a—" He didn't argue. He just let go of his absolute control. A guttural, bone-rattling sound tore from his throat. Right in front of my face, his irises, previously a normal, stormy hazel, flooded with a piercing, unnatural, luminous gold. The muscles in his forearms rippled violently. He slammed his hands down onto my expensive, stainless steel examination table, to brace himself against the shift. Screech. The sound of elongating, thick black talons, gouging deeply into medical-grade steel, echoed through the room. He stayed there, breathing heavily, his golden eyes locked onto mine. He was waiting for me to scream. He was waiting for me to faint, to cry, to beg for my life. Now that I realized, I was trapped in a room with a biological impossibility. I didn't scream. I looked at his glowing eyes, then looked down at the deep, permanent, jagged trenches carved into my pristine examination table. "Do you have any idea?" I whispered, my voice trembling with pure, unadulterated financial rage. "How much a surgical-grade, hydraulic lift steel table costs?" The glowing gold in his eyes flickered, completely disrupted by my reaction. He blinked, the talons slowly retracting. "What?" $2,000, I answered, stepping around him and snatching my clipboard off the counter. I clicked my pen with a vicious snap. $2,000, plus the drywall repair for the phone, plus emergency after-hours fee, plus the pediatric Band-Aids. I furiously scribbled on the paper, tore the invoice off, and slapped it directly onto his bare, muscular chest. He stared at the paper fluttering to the floor, absolutely dumbfounded. The rattling at the front door intensified. A heavy thud shook the glass. He looked from the door back to me, an unhinged, desperate realization dawning on his face. You have absolutely no self-preservation instincts." "I have native $400 in my checking account," I snapped. "I fear the IRS significantly more than I fear you." A low, rich chuckle rumbled out of him, taking me completely by surprise. He snatched a pair of my surgical scrubs off the counter and stepped into them. They were comically small, tight around his calves. "Fine. A proposition, human. Drive me out of these mountains, to my city territory, and pretend to be my wildly devoted mate, so my counsel doesn't realize I was bested in a street brawl." I gave him a look of absolute disgust. "Pretend to be your what?" "My mate. Faking an intimate bond is the only political excuse I have for disappearing during the solstice." "Do this?" He leaned down, his face inches from mine, the golden hue completely gone from his eyes, but the intensity remaining. "And I will buy you 100 steel tables. If you critique my clutching one more time, I will pull over and leave you for the snowplows." "I am merely observing," he grumbled, his massive knees pressed painfully against the dashboard. "That a vehicle this structurally compromised shouldn't legally be permitted on public asphalt. I can see the highway through a rust hole in the floorboard." "It's called ventilation," I lied, aggressive downshifting, as we took a treacherous, icy hairpin turn down the mountain. The escape from the clinic had been profoundly undignified. While the rival scouts were busy rattling the front doors, I had shoved the alpha king of the metropolis out the back delivery exit. He had expected a sleek getaway vehicle. Instead, he got my 2012 mobile veterinary van. It was a rusted white monstrosity. Emblazoned across the entire side panel was a badly painted, giant, cartoonish golden retriever holding a stethoscope. He had stared at the mural in the blizzard for a solid 30 seconds, the snow piling on his shoulders, before flatly stating, "I would rather face my enemies." It took me threatening to leave him in the snowbank, with a box of dog treats to get him into the passenger seat. Now we were crawling down the treacherous mountain pass, the van's heaters blasting a pathetic stream of tepid air that smelled faintly of wet fur and sterile wipes. The physical proximity was a nightmare. The van's cab was designed for 2 normal-sized humans. Declan, which he finally admitted was his name, reluctantly, was roughly the size of a commercial refrigerator. His broad shoulders encroached completely onto my side of the console. Every time I had to shift gears, my knuckles brushed against his muscular thigh. He was radiating body heat in the freezing cab, and despite my absolute refusal to find him attractive, the constant, accidental friction was sending sharp, unwanted sparks of awareness straight up my arm. "Watch the ice," he ordered, his jaw clenched as he stared out the windshield. I am watching the ice, Declan, I snapped, aggressively jerking the steering wheel. I've driven this pass every winter for 5 years. Stop backseat driving. I am not backseat driving. I am sitting in the front seat, trying to preserve my own life. He shifted uncomfortably, a box of liver-flavored dog treats rattling against his elbow. He picked up the box, reading the label with deep disdain. Are we truly relying on a relationship ruse to fool my counsel? Look at us. We look like a hostage situation. Hey, this was your terrible idea, I reminded him, keeping my eyes glued to the snowy road. You're the one who needs a fake girlfriend to protect your precious political image. And for the record, I am the one settling here. My standards are usually much higher than naked men found in dumpsters. It was a snowdrift, he corrected darkly. Semantics. We fell into a tense, highly charged silence. The mountain roads slowly smoothed out, giving way to the salted highways of the outer suburbs. The blinding white of the blizzard faded into the relentless, sprawling, neon glow of the metropolis. I had never liked the city. It was loud, expensive, and completely devoid of the quiet isolation I used to protect myself. But as we drove deeper into the urban grid, Declan's demeanor shifted again. The grumpy, awkward patient vanished. He sat up straighter, his jaw locking into sharp, commanding lines. Watching him look out the window at the towering skyscrapers, I realized with a jolt of anxiety just how out of my depth I really was. This wasn't just a big guy in my clinic anymore. This was his territory. Take the next exit, he commanded, his voice devoid of any banter. I obeyed, navigating the lumbering vet van through the slick, pristine city streets. We bypassed the regular financial district, heading straight toward a towering, ultra-modern glass skyscraper that seemed to pierce the low-hanging clouds. It looked like the headquarters of an evil tech corporation in a sci-fi movie. Pull into the private underground loading dock, he instructed. I can't, I said, gesturing to the heavy steel barricades and the 2 massive men in dark suits standing guard out front. There's security. They work for me. I rolled my eyes, easing the van forward. The guards stepped up, looking ready to forcibly eject my embarrassing, rusted vehicle from the premises. But as I rolled the window down, Declan leaned his head across the console. The guards took one look at his face, went completely pale, and instantly scrambled to hit the gate release button. The heavy steel barricade swung open. I slowly drove the van with the derpy golden retriever mural down into a subterranean garage filled exclusively with millions of dollars worth of matte black luxury sedans. I parked the van between 2 pristine Aston Martins. The contrast was physically painful. I turned off the ignition, the engine sputtering and wheezing for an embarrassing 5 seconds before finally dying. I gripped the steering wheel, looking up at the sterile, intimidating concrete walls of the billionaire bunker. My cynical armor suddenly feeling very, very thin. I turned my head to look at Declan, who was already unbuckling his seatbelt, with a look of terrifying, absolute authority. Just so we are perfectly clear, I muttered, my voice tight. I am going to charge you double for this. The private elevator ride from the subterranean garage to the penthouse was agonizingly silent, save for the soft, ambient hum of machinery and the aggressive squeaking of my wet winter boots on the polished mahogany floor. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the digital floor indicator, refusing to look at the massive man standing beside me. Despite the absurdly tight surgical scrubs straining across his thighs, Declan radiated an oppressive, suffocating heat in the confined space. I could smell the faint, coppery scent of his healing wounds beneath the sterile scent of my pediatric Band-Aids. The doors chimed and slid open. I stepped out, expecting a standard high-end apartment. Instead, I walked into a sprawling, sterile fortress of glass, steel, and slate. You live in an Apple store, I muttered, dropping my canvas duffel bag onto a marble entryway table. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the metropolis. The city lights reflecting off surfaces that looked too expensive to breathe on. There was not a single throw pillow, family photo, or sign of actual human life anywhere. It is efficient, Declan grunted. He stepped past me, his heavy limp completely betraying the nonchalant alpha posture he was trying to project. He marched directly toward a kitchen that belonged on the cover of an architectural digest. We need ground rules if you are to reside here until the solstice. Rule number 1, I countered, shrugging off my damp parka and following him. You turn the thermostat up. It feels like a meat locker in here, and I am not freezing to death to accommodate your abnormal, furry metabolism. The temperature remains at 60 degrees, he stated flatly, grabbing the handle of a complicated, chrome-plated Italian espresso machine. My body runs hot. I will not sweat in my own domicile. You are currently wearing my scrub pants, Declan. You lost the right to dictate domicile rules when I dragged your naked body out of a snowbank. I stepped up beside him, reaching for the digital thermostat panel mounted on the slate wall. He didn't even look at me. He just reached out, his massive calloused hand hovering directly over mine, caging my fingers against the wall without actually touching them. The sheer, radiating heat rolling off his skin was staggering. My breath hitched, a completely involuntary, humiliating biological betrayal. 60 degrees, he repeated, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with that low, chest-rumbling authority. I glared up at his sharp jawline. 70. Or I tell your counsel you have a SpongeBob Band-Aid on your left glute. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. Frustration completely overtook him. He turned back to the espresso machine, gripped the heavy chrome handle, and yanked it downward with a ferocious grunt. Snap. The sound of shattering metal echoed through the cavernous kitchen. We both froze. I looked down. Declan was holding the entire, sheared-off filter handle of the $5,000 machine. Boiling water and dark espresso grounds began to rapidly spew across the pristine white countertops, hissing as they hit the floor. He stared at the broken metal in his hand, a look of profound, exhausted defeat washing over his face. The terrifying king of the city was entirely undone by modern plumbing. Efficient, I noted dryly, grabbing a stack of linen and towels and tossing them onto the spreading puddle. He dropped the broken handle into the sink with a heavy clatter. He leaned his hips against the counter, running a hand over his face. He looked incredibly tired, the weight of the day, the ambush, the escape, the humiliation, finally crashing down on his broad shoulders. For a fraction of a second, I felt a dangerous, terrifying pang of actual sympathy for him. I stepped closer, reaching out to hand him another towel. Ping. The private elevator chimed behind us. Declan's spine snapped completely straight. The vulnerability vanished, replaced instantly by a rigid, terrifying stillness. I spun around. Stepping out of the elevator was a man in a flawless, charcoal-gray tailored suit. He had sharp, aristocratic features and perfectly styled hair. His eyes swept over the massive puddle of espresso, my cheap winter boots on the marble, and finally landed on Declan, who was still wearing my ridiculously tight surgical scrubs. The man's lips curled into a sneer of pure, unfiltered aristocratic disdain. Declan, the man drawled, his voice slick and polished, echoing off the glass walls. I was informed by security that you arrived in a commercial plumbing vehicle. I see the situation is somehow even more degrading than described. Declan stepped entirely in front of me, shielding my body with his massive frame. The casual heat rolling off him had instantly turned sharp, defensive, and deeply dangerous. Torin, you are uninvited. I am the head of the financial committee. Torin replied smoothly, stepping into the living room and ignoring the territorial hostility radiating from Declan. When the Alpha King vanishes on the eve of the most critical zoning vote of the decade and returns smelling like wet dog and cheap antiseptic, it is my business. Torin's eyes flicked over Declan's shoulder, landing squarely on me. He looked at my messy bun, my oversized sweater, and the coffee-stained towel in my hand, like I was a piece of trash that had blown in through the vents. And who exactly is this? The maid? I opened my mouth to verbally destroy him, but Declan beat me to it. Panic, raw, unfiltered, and entirely out of character, flashed in Declan's golden eyes. He stiffened, his broad shoulders locking into place. "She is my mate." The silence that followed was absolute. Torin stopped walking. He blinked, a slow condescending smile spreading across his face. "Your mate? Truly? The alpha who has refused every genetically suitable heiress for 5 years has suddenly mated with a human who looks like she buys her clothing by the pound?" That was it. My pride, already battered by the sheer absurdity of the last 6 hours, snapped completely in half. I didn't just lean into the lie. I swan-dived into it. I stepped out from behind Declan's broad back and threw my arms directly around his waist. He was built like a solid brick wall, and the moment my hands locked over his stomach, every single muscle in his abdomen violently contracted. He went completely rigid, his breath catching audibly in his throat. "Oh, sweetie, don't let this grumpy guy get to you," I chirped, pitching my voice to a horrific, chaotic, entirely unhinged level of sweetness. I leaned my head against Declan's heavily muscled bicep and batted my eyelashes at Torin. "Doodle is just so protective of our special bond. Aren't you, Snoozy?" Declan let out a sound that was half choke, half growl. I pushed his waist hard, a silent command to play along. Torin looked physically repulsed. He took a step back, pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket and dabbing at his upper lip, as if my mere presence had contaminated the air. "Declan? Doodle?" "We met in the mountains," I continued, tracing a completely unnecessary, highly distracting circle on Declan's chest. Beneath my fingertips, his heart was hammering against his ribs with frantic, terrifying speed. It was love at first sight. He just swept me off my feet. Literally. We haven't been able to keep our hands off each other since. To prove my point, I tilted my head up and kissed Declan directly on the jawline. His entire body shuddered. The sharp, overwhelming scent of pine and heavy, primal tension flared in the room. His hand came down, wrapping around my waist with crushing, possessive force, pulling me flush against his hip. It was supposed to be a fake gesture to sell the lie, but the sheer heat of his grip made my stomach execute a violent, terrifying flip. Torin's eyes narrowed into thin, calculating slits. He looked back and forth between us, clearly searching for the deception. "How remarkably convenient," Torin murmured, his voice dripping with venom. He slipped the handkerchief back into his pocket and straightened his cuffs. "And a sudden, unannounced mating bond just days before the council votes on your fitness to lead. If she is truly your fated equal, Declan, you will have no objection to proving it." "Proving it?" Declan rumbled, his grip on my hip tightening protectively. "Tomorrow morning." "Bring her to the corporate headquarters," Torin demanded, a cruel, triumphant glint in his eye. "And tomorrow night, she will attend the elders' dinner. If she is to sit beside you, we must assess her genetic suitability. Do not be late, Snooky." The elevator doors slid shut, sealing Torin away. The headquarters of the Metropolitan Pack looked exactly like a Fortune 500 investment bank, with one glaring, terrifying difference. Every single person in a tailored suit moved like a predator. I stood in the center of the sprawling glass-walled lobby, clutching my clipboard tightly against my chest. The air smelled of ozone, expensive espresso, and an underlying, heavy musk that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Do not leave my side," Declan murmured, pressing a hand to the small of my back as we walked toward the executive elevators. He was back in his element, wearing a bespoke, black suit that perfectly concealed his bruises, projecting an aura of sheer, unadulterated power. "I have zero intention of wandering off," I whispered back, eyeing a group of analysts who were staring at me with entirely too much intensity. "This place is a nightmare. Why is everyone looking at my jugular?" "They are assessing your scent," Declan explained quietly, his jaw locked tight. He was radiating a low-level hum of anxiety, his eyes darting around the lobby, silently edging out anyone who looked at me for a fraction of a second too long. "You are human. You are standing next to their alpha. Their biology is trying to categorize you." "Well, their biology needs a lesson in workplace etiquette," I snapped. The elevator ride to the executive floor was agonizing. When the doors opened, we stepped into a bullpen of high-end cubicles. As we walked down the aisle toward Declan's corner office, the subtle, annoying behavior escalated. A man from accounting walked past, ostensibly reviewing a tablet. But he leaned aggressively into my personal space, his nose flaring as he took a deep, invasive breath right next to my ear. I flinched, stepping closer to Declan. 10 feet later, a woman from marketing handed Declan a file, but her eyes were entirely fixed on me. She leaned over the folder, tilting her head and taking a sharp, audible sniff of my hair. "Okay, absolutely not," I announced, stopping dead in the middle of the hallway. I rolled up my heavy plastic-backed financial clipboard. "I am a professional veterinarian. I spend my days getting coughed on by golden retrievers. I will not tolerate being treated like a fire hydrant by a bunch of billionaires in Prada." "Fiona?" Declan warned, his voice low. "No. We are instituting a policy right now." I turned to a sleek, aggressive-looking vice president, who was currently angling his body to block my path to the office, his nostrils flaring subtly. I raised the rolled-up clipboard and pointed it directly at his nose. "Back up, buddy. No smelling the vet." The vice president stopped, entirely shocked. He looked at the plastic clipboard, then looked down at me with a slow, dangerous sneer. "You do not give orders here, human. You smell like weakness and fear. You do not belong on this floor." He took a deliberate, threatening step toward me, leaning down until his face was inches from mine, openly challenging my boundary. Before I could even swing the clipboard, the air pressure in the hallway vanished. Declan moved. It wasn't human speed. 1 second he was standing beside me, and the next, his massive hands clamped around the vice president's throat. With a terrifying, effortless surge of brute strength, Declan lifted the man completely off his feet and slammed him backward into the frosted glass wall of the boardroom. The glass spiderwebbed under the impact. The entire floor went dead silent. Declan didn't shout. He didn't have to. He leaned in close to the gasping executive, his eyes flashing a brilliant, blinding gold. A sound tore out of Declan's chest, a low, demonic, vibrating snarl that bypassed my ears and rattled directly in my bone marrow. It was the purest manifestation of absolute, lethal possessiveness. "If you breathe her air again," Declan whispered, his voice a gravelly death sentence, "I will rip your throat out with my teeth. Do you understand?" Vice President, completely abandoning his corporate posturing, choked out a terrified whimper of submission, his eyes wide with absolute panic. Declan dropped him. The man collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Declan slowly turned his head to look at me. His chest was heaving, his golden eyes burning with a furious, unhinged intensity that had absolutely nothing to do with political acting. The fake relationship was gone. The monster looking at me was entirely, terrifyingly real. And he was looking at me like I belonged to him. The terrifying, lethal silence of the corporate hallway was completely eclipsed by the suffocating, hostile quiet of the elder's private dining room. 5 hours later, we sat at a ridiculously long polished mahogany table that looked like it belonged in a medieval banquet hall. 12 men and women in couture sat around us, their plates piled high with absurdly rare cuts of meat, while they actively stared at my jugular. The air in the room was thick with the metallic scent of blood and barely concealed aggression. Beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, Declan's thick, muscular thigh was pressed firmly against mine. It was the only thing keeping me from bolting for the service elevators. His sheer body heat was a solid, grounding anchor in a room full of apex predators who were currently dissecting my every move as if I were the appetizer. I simply do not understand the logistics. An ancient man named Elder Darius drawled, swirling a glass of dark red wine. He looked at me with the kind of clinical, aristocratic disgust one usually reserved for a cockroach. To bond with a human, so your cellular regeneration is non-existent, your bone density is laughable, your lifespans are tragically brief. A stiff winter breeze could snap your spine. What possible genetic advantage could this Peculiar union bring to the pack, Declan. Declan's hand vanished from the top of the table. A second later, his thick fingers wrapped possessively around my knee under the cloth. A low, warning vibration started deep in his chest. The exact same terrifying, bone-rattling rumble he had used right before he threw that vice president through a frosted glass wall earlier this afternoon. He was about to end the entire political charade with a very public homicide, before he could flip the massive table and ruin the fragile lie keeping his crown intact. I casually picked up my silver soup spoon. Actually, I interrupted, my voice perfectly crisp and steady as I looked Darius directly in his glowing eyes. Your accelerated cellular regeneration is a metabolic nightmare. The entire table froze. Forks hovered mid-air. I leaned forward, tapping my spoon against my porcelain bowl. The sheer caloric intake required to maintain your abnormal muscle density means you are highly susceptible to acute adrenal fatigue. In large mammals, particularly draft horses, overmuscling without proper joint support leads to early-onset arthritis, ligament snapping, and severe cardiac stress by age 40. So, biologically speaking, your species is basically a high-maintenance sports car with a terrible factory warranty. Torin, sitting at the far end of the table, choked violently on his wine. He grabbed a napkin, coughing into the expensive silk, completely losing his polished composure. I didn't stop. I turned my attention back to Darius, offering him a pleasant customer service smile. Furthermore, the amount of body heat you produce is incredibly inefficient. You rely on sheer bulk rather than proper fat insulation. It is a biological tragedy, really. Pass the dinner rolls, please. Elder Darius's jaw slacked. His arrogant sneer dissolved into absolute profound shock. He looked utterly destroyed by basic veterinary science. No one had spoken to an elder with such blatant, clinical disrespect in 3 centuries. The silence stretched out, fragile and highly explosive. Beneath the table, Declan's thumb slowly, deliberately stroked the sensitive skin behind my knee. He leaned heavily into my space, his broad shoulder brushing against mine. The sharp, overwhelming scent of pine and sudden, intense heat washed over me, short-circuiting my brain. He lowered his head, pressing his lips so close to my ear that I could feel the faint, uneven brush of his breath against my skin. "That," Declan whispered, his voice a gravelly, deeply uneven rasp, "is the sexiest thing I have ever witnessed." By the time we returned to the penthouse, the adrenaline that had fueled my bravado at the dinner was completely gone, leaving behind a heavy, dangerous exhaustion. The city lights bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the sterile marble floors. Declan hadn't spoken a word since the elevator ride up, but the physical tension rolling off him was thick enough to choke on. "Sit on the edge of the tub," I ordered softly, gesturing toward the massive slate bathroom. "I need to check the lacerations on your leg. The dinner lasted 3 hours, and you were hiding a limp the entire time." He didn't argue. The terrifying, commanding alpha from the dining room vanished, replaced by the quiet, intensely guarded man I had dragged out of the snow. He stripped off his tailored suit jacket, tossing it carelessly onto the floor, and rolled up his expensive trousers. He sat on the edge of the sunken marble tub, his broad shoulders slumped in exhaustion. I grabbed my canvas medical bag and knelt on the heated floor tiles directly between his parted knees. The sheer proximity was instantly suffocating. The bathroom was warm, smelling faintly of the expensive cedar soap he used, mixed with the musky, primal scent of his lingering adrenaline. I carefully peeled back the bright yellow pediatric band-aids on his calf. The bruising was horrific, deep purple and black, but the jagged claw marks from his ambush were already knitting together with impossible speed. "You defended me," he murmured. His deep baritone echoed slightly against the tile, lacking all its usual demanding edge. "I defended veterinary logic," I corrected, keeping my eyes firmly on my work. My hands were shaking slightly. Darius was being scientifically inaccurate. I hate scientific inaccuracy. "Fiona," he reached down. His massive, calloused fingers caught my chin, gently but firmly tilting my face up. I stopped breathing, the sarcastic banter, the defensive walls, the financial ledgers. Everything I used to keep the world at arm's length evaporated under the weight of his stare. His golden eyes were entirely dark, searching my face with a terrifying level of raw vulnerability. His thumb brushed slowly across my lower lip. The friction sent a violent shockwave of heat straight down my spine. I have spent 5 years surrounded by people who only want to take my power or fear it, Declan whispered, his gaze dropping to my mouth. You are the only person who has ever looked at me and just seen me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The air in the bathroom grew impossibly heavy. He leaned down, closing the remaining distance between us. I could feel the heat of his skin, the frantic, thumping rhythm of his pulse mirroring my own. My eyes fluttered shut. We were millimeters apart, the fake dating lie completely shattering into something incredibly, terrifyingly real. Bring. The shrill, jarring ring of the encrypted security phone on the vanity shattered the silence like a gunshot. We jerked apart, gasping for air as if we had been drowning. Declan stared at me for a split second, his chest heaving, before he snatched the phone off the marble counter. He answered it, his jaw locking back into a rigid, furious line. "What?" he snarled into the receiver. He listened for exactly 5 seconds before his expression turned to pure ice. "When?" He hung up the phone and looked down at me, the intimacy completely gone, replaced by political dread. "That was Torrin," Declan said, his voice entirely hollow. "The council took a private vote after dinner. They are accelerating the schedule. We are summoned to the ancestral country estate immediately." The drive out of the metropolis took 2 hours, trading the neon glow of the city for the oppressive, sprawling darkness of the remote countryside. When the heavy, wrought iron gates of the ancestral Pack estate finally loomed out of the snowstorm, my stomach bottomed out completely. It wasn't just a house. It was a massive, Gothic stone fortress clinging to the side of a mountain, complete with terrifying gargoyles and windows that looked like they belonged in a haunted cathedral. "This is where you grew up?" I asked, staring out the van window in absolute horror. "It looks like Dracula's summer home. It looks like a place where joy goes to die." "It is highly defensible," Declan replied, defensively, gripping the steering wheel. "And the gargoyles are structural, mostly." The moment we parked in the cobblestone courtyard, a small army of silent, uniformed staff descended upon us. We were quickly ushered through cavernous, drafty stone halls, adorned with tapestries and ancient weaponry. The sheer scale of the shifter wealth was overwhelming. I felt intensely small, hyper-aware of my faded genes and the heavy, terrified thumping of my human heart. A stern-faced house opened a heavy oak door, ushering us inside. The Alpha's suite, as requested by the council. The door clicked shut, leaving us alone in a room that was roughly the size of my entire veterinary clinic. It was excessively lavish. Rich mahogany paneling, a roaring stone fireplace, and heavy velvet curtains. There was only one glaring issue. In the center of the room sat a massive, ridiculously ornate 4-poster bed. Just one. "Absolutely not," I stated, dropping my duffel bag onto a priceless antique rug. "I am not sleeping in that thing with you. You generate the body heat of a commercial pizza oven. I will wake up severely dehydrated." Declan didn't even argue. The imposing, terrifying Alpha King immediately defaulted to his chronic, awkward chivalry. He limped over to the closet, pulled out a pile of heavy fur blankets, and dumped them directly onto the hard, stone floor near the fireplace. "I will take the floor," he grunted, awkwardly attempting to arrange the pelts. "I am a king. I am entirely capable of sleeping on a rug." "Declan, you have a healing laceration on your calf and a bruised rib cage," I sighed, rubbing my temples. "You cannot sleep on the rocks. Get in the bed. I'll take the floor." "I will not allow my mate to sleep on the floor like a servant," he snapped, his protective instincts flaring up. He immediately sat down heavily onto the pile of furs, crossing his arms like a stubborn toddler. I am comfortable. This is optimal. He was lying. The man was massive, and the floor was literally made of flagstone. For the next 4 hours, the room was filled with the sounds of his suffering. Every 10 minutes, there was a heavy, dramatic sigh. Then a grunt of pain. Then the rustling of fur as he attempted to find a position that didn't aggravate his injured leg. Are you done shifting around down there? I called out from the absolute luxury of the massive mattress, staring at the canopy ceiling. You sound like a dying walrus. The floor is surprisingly unyielding. He grumbled from the darkness, his voice thick with misery. But I remain resolute. I couldn't help it. I laughed. A genuine, quiet laugh that seemed to break the heavy tension in the room. I felt the sudden, dangerous warmth of true trust settling in my chest. He was terrifying to the world, but, with me, he was just a grumpy, stubborn man who refused to let me be uncomfortable. I opened my mouth to tell him to just get into the bed. Knock, knock, knock. The sharp, aggressive pounding on the heavy oak door shattered the quiet intimacy. It was 6 a.m. Enter, Declan barked, sitting up stiffly. The door swung open. A team of 6 terrifyingly chic women marched into the room, rolling massive racks of shimmering, complicated fabric and carrying leather cases of measuring tape. Good morning, Alpha, the lead woman said, her eyes locking onto me with predatory focus. The winter solstice gala preparations begin now. The council demands perfection. There is no backing out. The 6 women did not style me. They launched a coordinated tactical assault. For 2 excruciating hours, I was plucked, pinned, and aggressively contoured by a team of silent, terrifyingly efficient seamstresses. They wrangled me into a midnight blue velvet gown that felt less like clothing and more like a hostile architectural masterpiece. It hugged every single line of my ribs, structured entirely by a terrifying labyrinth of microscopic hooks and a single, agonizingly fragile zipper running directly down my spine. The room smelled of aerosol hairspray and ozone. When the lead stylist pulled out a heavy, antique diamond tiara and lunged toward my head with a fistful of bobby pins, Declan finally hit his absolute limit. Enough, he barked from the shadowy corner of the suite. He was already dressed in a stark, immaculate black tuxedo that made him look like a lethal, highly weaponized James Bond. You are overwhelming her. Leave the hardware. Get out. The stylists scattered like frightened pigeons, leaving their metal carts behind. The heavy oak door clicked shut, abandoning me in front of the massive vanity mirror, with the back of my dress completely undone. The velvet bodice threatened to slide off my shoulders with every breath. I reached awkwardly over my shoulder, my fingers slipping uselessly against the heavy fabric. Declan, I am trapped in a velvet finger trap. I literally cannot reach the hardware without dislocating my shoulder. I told you to wear something sensible, he grumbled, though there was no real heat in his voice. I offered to procure a simple, functional garment. This looks like medieval armor. Your cousin handed this to me and told me it was spun from the silk of extinct spiders or something equally ridiculous. I sighed, gripping the edge of the vanity table. Just pull the zipper, architecture critic. And please try not to use your terrifying super strength. I still owe hundreds of thousands in student loans. I absolutely cannot afford to replace a historical, extinct spider gown if you rip the seam. Allow me, he murmured. He crossed the cavernous room, his heavy, slightly uneven footsteps, completely silent on the thick Persian rug. He stopped directly behind me. I watched him in the ornate mirror. He was so incredibly massive that he entirely eclipsed my reflection, his broad shoulders blocking out the roaring stone fireplace behind us. His thick, calloused knuckles brushed against the very base of my bare spine. I gasped. A sharp, entirely involuntary intake of air. His hands were built for warfare, for tearing through forests and crushing rivals. Yet he gripped the tiny, delicate metal zipper with excruciating, surgical care. He pulled it up, inch by agonizing inch. The slow drag of the cold metal, accompanied by the impossibly soft brush of his rough fingertipped skins, sent a cascade of wild, electrical statics straight to my brain. We fell entirely silent. The sarcastic armor we wore so effortlessly to protect ourselves simply vanished in the quiet of the room. The zipper locked into place at the nape of my neck. Declan didn't step back. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, his chest hovering a millimeter from my shoulders. The air in the room thickened, snapping with heavy, unspoken emotional weight. The proxim was devastating. Slowly, he lowered his massive head. He rested his forehead directly against my bare shoulder, letting out a ragged, deeply uneven exhale that stirred the loose hairs at the base of my neck. "I despise this place," he whispered. The absolute raw vulnerability in his gravelly voice fractured my heart completely. "I am terrified I will lose you to their politics tonight, Fiona. I cannot protect you once we cross that threshold." I reached back, my fingers tangling gently into the dark hair at the nape of his neck. "You couldn't lose me if you tried." A heavy, ominous brass gong echoed through the stone corridors. The solstice gala had officially begun. The grand ballroom looked like the Palace of Versailles had been violently hijacked by apex predators. Thousands of jagged crystal shards fractured the chandelier light, raining blinding illumination down over 300 of the most terrifying, elegantly dressed people I had ever seen. The ambient noise wasn't a standard polite cocktail murmur. It was a low, aggressive vibration of rumbling chests, clinking champagne flutes, and a frantic string quartet attacking their cellos in the corner. The air was suffocatingly thick with the scent of expensive French perfumes, actively trying to mask the heavy, primal musk of territorial aggression. "Keep your eyes forward," Declan instructed quietly. His hand rested with a firm, deeply protective weight at the small of my back as we began our descent down the grand marble staircase. "Do not bare your teeth if they smile to you. In this room it is not a greeting. It is considered a biological challenge. I am a licensed veterinarian, Declan." "Not a feral street cat," I muttered, through a rigidly pleasant, closed-mouth smile. "Though if someone tries to sniff my jugular again, I am absolutely biting them." We hit the ballroom floor, and the crowd instantly parted for us. It wasn't polite society etiquette. It was a sea of silks and velvet, parting out of pure biological deference to their alpha. It was a waking nightmare of passive-aggressive diplomacy. For an excruciating hour, we were cornered by ancient aristocrats who made thinly veiled insults disguised as polite small talk. They questioned my pedigree, my posture, and my complete lack of magical lineage. We survived entirely by forming a unified front of muttered, sarcastic commentary. At one point, a towering, silver-haired matron blocked our path, peering down her pointed nose at my simple diamond earrings. "How quaint," she sneered. "One must admire the bravery it takes to wear cubic zirconia to a royal solstice. One must admire the bravery it takes to wear that much hairspray near open candle flames," I replied pleasantly, not missing a beat. The matron turned a furious shade of plum and stormed away. Declan had to bite the inside of his cheek to hide a massive, rumbling laugh. A few minutes later, a server in a crisp white uniform drifted by, offering a silver tray of something dark, red, and entirely raw. "Is that steak tartare?" I whispered, leaning my head casually against Declan's solid bicep to avoid a woman glaring at me from the ice sculpture. "Venison," he corrected smoothly. He intercepted the server, taking 2 glasses of champagne and handing me one, deliberately placing his body between me and the glaring woman. "Hunted this morning on the northern estate grounds. I strongly advise against it. The kitchen notoriously lacks seasoning. You people are billionaires. Buy a salt shaker," I sighed, taking a massive, deeply needed gulp of the champagne. "You are one step away from just grazing in the yard." "A tragic lack of culinary evolution," he agreed, the corner of his mouth twitching into a rare, devastatingly handsome smirk. For a brief, shining moment, standing in the middle of the chaos, I forgot about the council, the crushing clinic debt, and the terrible aristocratic politics. Standing there with him, trading quiet insults about wealthy shifters, I realized we weren't just faking a partnership to survive the night anymore. We were actually operating as one cohesive unit. I felt safe. Then, the music abruptly stopped. The heavy, 12-foot mahogany doors at the main entrance to the ballroom burst completely open, slamming violently against the stone walls with a concussive boom. The entire ballroom went dead silent. The heavy string quartet screeched to a halt, leaving only the echoing reverberation of the slamming doors. Strolling through the grand archway were 3 men in sharply tailored, aggressive maroon suits. They didn't walk with the refined, arrogant grace of Declan's pack. They swaggered. It was the petty, deeply smug strut of alley thugs who had just won a violent lottery. I felt the thick muscle in Declan's jaw lock instantly. The firm, comforting pressure of his hand on my back turned into a rigid iron vice. These were the rivals, the ones who had ambushed him in the snow outside my clinic. The leader, a man with a jagged, ugly scar across his chin and a grotesquely arrogant smile, charted a path directly toward the center of the room. The aristocratic crowd parted for him, not out of respect, but out of sheer, scandalized, morbid curiosity. "Declan!" The rival leader drawled, his booming voice carrying perfectly over the silent, tense room. He stopped exactly 10 feet away, his eyes mocking and utterly fearless. "Look at you, hosting the solstice. Though I couldn't help but notice you're favoring your right leg tonight. Trip over your own crown?" A shocked gasp rippled through the hundreds of aristocrats. Declan's eyes flashed a lethal, blinding gold. He let go of my waist, his broad shoulders expanding as he prepared to abandon every ounce of diplomacy and end the man's life right there on the polished marble floor. I didn't let him. Before Declan could take a single catastrophic step forward, I moved. I stepped directly in front of the massive Alpha King, putting my completely fragile, human body squarely between him and his attacker. "He tore his meniscus," I said loudly, my voice ringing with absolute, unflinching clinical authority. The rival blinked, completely thrown off guard by a human woman interrupting a highly charged territorial dispute. "Excuse me?" "His meniscus," I repeated. I looked the rival up and down with profound, deeply insulting professional pity. "It's a very common knee injury. It usually happens when an apex predator is forced to quickly kick away a pack of desperate scavengers who lack the jaw strength to actually finish a fight." The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked, breathless whispers. The rival's smug smile vanished entirely, replaced by an ugly, furious flush. "Listen here, you pathetic little human. And judging by the highly asymmetrical swelling along your lower jawline," I interrupted, raising my champagne flute in a mock sarcastic toast, "it looks like he kicked you particularly hard. You really should ice that. It's making your face look incredibly lopsided." The rival bared his teeth, a guttural, furious snarl tearing from his throat. He shifted his weight to lunge at me. He didn't make it an inch. Declan was there. He didn't yell. He didn't shift. He simply wrapped one massive arm around my waist, pulling me flush against his chest, and stared the man down with a look of such absolute, terrifying dominance that the rival physically recoiled in pure biological terror. Declan wasn't angry anymore. He was completely captivated. He looked down at me like I had single-handedly hung the moon. Clap, clap, clap. Slow, sarcastic applause cut sharply through the heavy tension. Torrin stepped out from the whispering crowd, his calculating eyes darting between Declan's fiercely protective stance and the utterly humiliated rivals. "Brilliant," Torrin murmured, a wicked, triumphant glint in his dark eyes. "Such fierce loyalty. A bond so undeniably strong it must be written in the stars. Let us make it official, then." Torrin turned to the breathless crowd, raising his voice so it echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "Tonight, at the stroke of midnight, the Alpha and his destined mate will perform the ancient mating vows." We barricaded ourselves in the Alpha's suite. the heavy oak doors slamming shut against the impending doom of midnight. I instantly collapsed onto the priceless antique rug, the midnight blue velvet of my dress pooling around me like a deflated parachute. Declan did not sit, he paced. He stalked the perimeter of the cavernous room, calculating the structural integrity of the stone walls with the frantic energy of a caged predator. We could tie the draperies together, I suggested, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. Rappel down the north tower. I've seen it work in terrible spy movies. We just need to secure the velvet to a load-bearing gargoyle. It is a 4-story drop into a frozen ravine, Declan muttered, rubbing his jaw aggressively. And these curtains are purely decorative silk. You would plummet to a highly undignified demise. It's preferable to whatever a mating vow entails. I shot back, pushing myself up into a seated position. The heavy tiara on my head slipped sideways, giving me the distinct appearance of a heavily intoxicated prom queen. Just tell me what we have to do. We've fooled them all day. We just stand at an altar, say a few poetic lines about the moon, and fake a kiss, right? Declan stopped pacing. He turned to face me, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the roaring fire, and the look of sheer, unadulterated dread on his face made my stomach bottom out entirely. There is no poetry, Fiona, he rasped, his voice rough and devoid of all its usual commanding authority. It is not a ceremonial performance. It is a biological polygraph. I blinked, adjusting the crooked tiara. A what? A biometric assessment of total physiological submission, he explained grimly, closing the distance between us and kneeling on the hard stone floor. His sheer physical mass eclipsed the firelight. The elders will stand inches from us. They will monitor our pupil dilation, the exact rhythm of our pulses, and the microscopic shifts in our pheromones. If your body registers deception, elevated cortisol, or physical rejection when we declare the bond, they will smell the lie immediately. I can control my pulse, I argued, my voice pitching up in a frantic, unconvincing squeak. I'm a medical professional. I perform emergency surgeries on violently uncooperative livestock. I know how to box breathe. You cannot box breathe your way out of an involuntary pheromone release, Declan countered, his golden eyes locking onto mine with devastating intensity. The moment I touch you, the moment I claim you in front of the pack, your biology will react to the duress. The stress of the lie will expose us. Panic, cold, sharp, and entirely clinical, flooded my veins. He was right. Every time he had touched me today, my heart rate had spiked into a chaotic, terrifying rhythm. But it wasn't because of the lie. It was because the lie was rapidly dissolving. Okay, fine, I whispered, my defensive sarcasm entirely failing me. So we fail the biological test. What happens then? Treason, Declan stated bluntly. Falsifying a mating bond to retain the alpha position is an unforgivable breach of pack law. I will be exiled and Torin will seize the territory. The heavy, ominous tolling of the estate's grandfather clock echoed through the stone corridors. 11:45. Declan reached out, his thick, calloused fingers gently writing the heavy diamond tiara on my head. He didn't pull away. His thumb brushed against my cheekbone, his touch agonizingly gentle for a man built for warfare. I brought you into this absurdity to save my own pride, Fiona. I will not let my counsel tear you apart for my mistakes. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. The forced proximity, the impossible wealth, the sheer terrifying danger of the political game. None of it mattered. As I stared into his deeply exhausted, fiercely loyal eyes, the terrifying truth finally clicked into place. I wasn't scared of failing the biological polygraph because I was lying. I was terrified of passing it. I was genuinely, hopelessly in love with this chronically awkward, overly dramatic werewolf king. And walking down that aisle meant laying my closely guarded heart completely bare on a silver platter. The heavy brass gong echoed outside our door. The escort had arrived. The midnight procession felt less like a romantic ceremony and more like a highly coordinated march to the guillotine. The grand ballroom had been entirely cleared of its dining tables, The 300 aristocrats now formed a massive, suffocating circle in the center of the marble floor, their eyes unblinking, their collective silence heavy and oppressive. At the far end of the circle stood Torin, his arms crossed, a sickeningly triumphant smirk plastered across his aristocratic face. Declan's hand gripped mine with a crushing, anchoring force as we walked down the center aisle. He was a flawless picture of alpha dominance, spine rigid, jaw locked, his dark tuxedo cutting a lethal silhouette against the crystal lighting. But beneath the stoic facade, I could feel the microscopic tremor in his fingers. We reached the center of the circle. Elder Darius stepped forward, flanked by two other ancient, terrifyingly observant council members. "The solstice demands truth," Darius announced, his voice vibrating with predatory anticipation. He stepped uncomfortably close, leaning in until I could literally feel the draft of his breath. "Present your pulses." Declan turned to face me. This was it, the biological polygraph. He lifted my hand, pressing my wrist directly against his own, so the heavy, erratic thud of my human heart beat flush against his thick veins. The elders leaned in closer, their nostrils flaring as they aggressively sampled the air, waiting for the acrid scent of deceit to poison the room. I looked up into Declan's face. My walls were entirely gone. All my cynical armor, my financial ledgers, my desperate need for absolute independence. It all crumbled under the weight of his golden, searching eyes. I wasn't acting. My pulse was racing, not from the duress of a lie, but from the terrifying, undeniable reality of my feelings. Darius' eyes narrowed. He sniffed the air, looking profoundly confused. "Her pheromones, they are not registering rejection. The pulse is elevated, but..." Torin stepped forward, his polished composure slipping into a desperate snarl. "She is manipulating her breath. She is a medical doctor. She knows how to suppress a panic response. Force the vocal declaration, Declan. Claim her and let the pack smell the truth of her submission." Declan's eyes snapped to Torin, flashing a brilliant, lethal gold. But then he looked back down at me. He saw it. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror swimming in my eyes. It wasn't the terror of being caught in a lie. It was the sheer panic of a woman realizing she was about to surrender her fiercely defended independence to a world she didn't belong to. Declan's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. Slowly, deliberately, he let go of my wrist. The sudden loss of his grip felt like a physical blow. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. Darius stumbled backward, completely scandalized. Torin barked, a mixture of shock and glee coloring his voice. "What are you doing?" "I am ending this farce," Declan said. His voice didn't boom. It was a quiet, gravelly death knell that carried to every single corner of the silent ballroom. He turned his back on me, facing the elders with absolute, unflinching defiance. "There is no fated bond," Declan declared, stripping the deception away with brutal efficiency. "This mating is a complete political fabrication. I coerced her into this charade to circumvent the council's archaic demands. She holds no loyalty to this pack, and she owes you absolutely nothing." "Declan, stop!" I choked out, stepping forward, but he held up a hand, refusing to look at me. He was deliberately cutting the cord, protecting me by making himself the sole villain. "By the laws of the solstice," Torin shouted, practically vibrating with victory, "admitting to a fraudulent mating in front of the council constitutes an immediate forfeiture of the alpha title." "The law, Torin," Declan sneered, ripping the heavy ceremonial silver clasp from the lapel of his tuxedo. He tossed it onto the marble floor. It clattered with a sharp, devastating finality. "The title is yours. May you choke on the paperwork." Without another word, Declan turned on his heel. He didn't run. Walk with slow, dignified limp of a defeated king, pushing his way through the stunned crowd of aristocrats, marching straight out of the heavy mahogany doors and disappearing into the freezing, relentless blizzard outside. The heavy thud of the estate doors closing echoed through the silent room, leaving me entirely alone in a sea of predators. The silence in the grand ballroom was so profound I could hear the faint, frantic scratching of ice against the massive cathedral windows, Nimes. Torin stood in the center of the marble floor, staring at the discarded silver alpha clasp with absolute, unfiltered greed. He leaned down, scooping the emblem up and clutching it to his pristine, tailored suit. "Well," Torin drawled, turning to address the stunned council, a slick, victorious smile stretching across his face. "It appears the pack requires new leadership. A leader who does not sully our bloodline by dragging unhinged, debt-ridden, human veterinarians into our sacred halls." He turned his condescending gaze on me, waving his hand dismissively. "Security. Escort the human off the mountain. Leave her in the nearest commercial parking lot." Two massive men in maroon suits stepped forward, their faces blank. I looked at the heavy mahogany doors where Declan had just disappeared. He had thrown away his entire life, his legacy, and his pride just to ensure I could go back to my failing clinic and my cynical isolation. He had given me exactly what I wanted, and I absolutely hated it. "Don't touch me," I snapped, sidestepping the nearest guard with such aggressive speed, the man actually blinked in surprise. I didn't run for the exit. I turned my back on the doors, grabbed the heavy, restrictive skirt of my extinct spider velvet gown, and marched directly toward Torin in the center of the room. "Excuse me?" Torin demanded, his aristocratic composure faltering as I stormed into his personal space. "You have no voice here, human. I have a medical degree and a functioning frontal lobe, which clearly puts me entirely in charge of this room." I fired back, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at the center of Torin's chest. "You want to talk about leadership? Let's talk about your severe lack of situational awareness." Elder Darius opened his mouth to intervene, but I cut him off with a vicious glare. "Zip it, Darius. I am giving a biological assessment." I turned back to Torin, refusing to break eye contact. "You spent the entire day micromanaging the catering and trying to smell my neck for weaknesses. Do you know what you missed? The fact that a rival pack ambushed your alpha in a commercial parking lot 3 days ago." A shocked, furious murmur rippled through the 300 aristocrats. Torin's face went chalk white. That is a lie." "It's a fact," I countered loudly, projecting my voice to the entire room. They attacked him to disrupt the zoning vote. And instead of starting a violent turf war that would have dragged this entire estate into a legal bloodbath, Declan took the hit. He walked away with bruised ribs, a torn meniscus to protect your precious, fragile political ecosystem. I took another step forward, forcing Torin to actually back up. "He is terrible at modern appliances," I continued, my voice shaking with a potent mixture of rage and raw emotion. "He is aggressively awkward. He complains about sleeping on the floor, and he uses phrases like procure a garment. But he is the only person in this room who actually gives a damn about the people he leads. You didn't win this title, Torin. He threw it at you because he would rather lose everything than force me into a lie." I looked around the circle of perfectly dressed, stunned wolves. If you let a man who prioritizes tables over physical ambushes lead you, your pack won't survive the fiscal year. Biologically speaking, you are handing the wheel to a concussed goldfish. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't care about pack law, council votes, or shifter politics. I turned on my heel, kicked off my impossibly high designer heels, and left them sitting in the center of the marble floor. Barefoot, I sprinted across the ballroom, shoved the heavy mahogany doors open, and ran out into the freezing blizzard to find my terrifying, chronically awkward alpha. The blizzard hit me like a physical wall the second I pushed through the heavy oak doors. The snow was already ankle-deep on the cobblestone courtyard. My bare feet went entirely numb within 3 steps, the crushed ice biting viciously into my skin. The midnight blue velvet of the extinct spider gown acted like a sponge, dragging heavily through the slush as I sprinted away from the fortress and toward the dense, imposing tree line of the estate grounds. "Declan," I screamed, the wind immediately snatching the sound from my lungs. I stumbled over a hidden root, dropping to my knees in the snow. I didn't care. I pushed myself back up, squinting through the blinding white sheet of the storm. I found him exactly where I expected to, brooding in the absolute most dramatic place possible. He was standing at the edge of a frozen ravine, staring out into the absolute darkness of the mountains. He hadn't bothered to shift into his wolf form. He was just standing there in his ruined, snow-dusted tuxedo, letting the blizzard batter his broad shoulders as if he felt he deserved the punishment. "You dramatic, chronically awkward martyr!" I yelled, my voice cracking over the howling wind. Declan spun around. Through the blinding snow, I saw his massive frame go completely rigid. His eyes, dark, entirely devoid of the glowing alpha gold, widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as he took in my state. "Fiona," he roared, closing the distance between us in 3 impossibly fast, ground-eating strides. He didn't stop until he was towering directly over me. "What are you doing out here? Where are your shoes? You are a fragile human. You will lose your toes to frostbite in exactly 4 minutes." "Oh, so now we care about biology?" I snapped, shivering violently as I tilted my head all the way back to glare at him. "Because 10 minutes ago you just handed your entire legacy to a man whose greatest evolutionary trait micromanaging catering." Declan grabbed my shoulders, his massive, calloused hands gripping the freezing velvet of my dress. He didn't emit supernatural body heat, which I had explicitly reminded him was biologically inefficient anyway. But the sheer physical barrier of his massive chest completely blocked the biting wind, creating a tiny, quiet pocket of shelter in the middle of the storm. "I gave him the title so you could leave," Declan growled, his voice a ragged, desperate rasp. "I freed you, Fiona. You were terrified in there. I smelled your pulse spiking. I saw your eyes. I refused to trap you in a cage built of my own political lies." "I wasn't terrified of the lies, you idiot." I shoved my hands hard against his solid, unyielding chest. I was terrified because it wasn't a lie anymore. I was terrified because the thought of walking away from your grumpy, overprotective, absurdly large self was vastly more horrifying than dealing with your snobbish counsel. Declan froze entirely. The wind howled through the pines, but in the small space between us, the silence was deafening. "What did you just say?" he whispered. "I told the council you were the only alpha worth following," I confessed, my teeth chattering as the adrenaline began to fade. "I told Torin he had the situational awareness of a concussed goldfish. And then I ran out here, barefoot, to tell you that I am not going back to my failing clinic unless you are sitting in this passenger seat of my terrible van complaining about the suspension." Declan stared down at me. The defensive, stoic mask he had worn for 5 years completely shattered. Slowly, deliberately, he slid his rough hands up my neck, his thumbs tracing the line of my jaw with agonizing reverence. The physical proximity was suddenly intoxicating. I could smell the sharp ozone of the storm mixed with his deep, primal scent of crushed pine needles. "You defended me," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, devastating rumble that vibrated straight through my frozen skin. "You stood in a room full of apex predators, and you called them goldfish." Biologically speaking, it was a very accurate insult, I whispered breathlessly. "You are a menace," he breathed, leaning his forehead heavily against mine. "An absolute, terrifying menace." "I'm your menace," I corrected. He didn't hesitate anymore. Declan's mouth crashed down on mine, and it was entirely devoid of the careful, awkward chivalry he usually practiced. It was a raw, bruising, and deeply spicy collision of desperation and relief. His massive arm wrapped entirely around my waist, lifting me completely off the freezing snow so my bare feet dangled in the air. I tangled my freezing fingers into the damp, dark hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. Every ounce of cynical armor I had built over the last decade melted into nothingness under the sheer, unyielding force of his claim. He wasn't faking a bond for his counsel. He was claiming me for himself. When we finally broke apart, we were both gasping, my forehead resting against his strong jaw. "We have a problem, however," Declan murmured. pressing a lingering, possessive kiss to the corner of my mouth. "What?" I asked, my brain completely short-circuited by the kiss. "You just verbally decimated my cousin in front of 300 aristocrats," he noted, a wicked, entirely genuine smile finally breaking across his face. "Which means, if I do not walk back in there and reclaim my title immediately, they will likely elect you as their new alpha." I let out a sharp, breathless laugh, wrapping my arms tighter around his broad shoulders. "Well, my first decree as alpha will be to ban venison tartare, so you better carry me back inside before I start a culinary revolution." Declan chuckled, a rich, booming sound that echoed over the roaring blizzard. He adjusted his grip, holding me securely against his chest like I weighed absolutely nothing, and turned back toward the imposing stone fortress. The council wanted a compliant king and a genetically perfect queen. Instead, they were getting a chronically awkward, brutally honest alpha and his fiercely cynical, debt-ridden human veterinarian. They were never going to know what hit them,